I knew something was wrong the second I turned into my quiet little cul-de-sac and saw the back end of my truck already lifted off the pavement like it was stolen property. The tow rig's hydraulic arm groaned under the weight, amber lights flashing against the neat rows of houses in Redstone Hollow. For a split second, I honestly thought I had parked in the wrong driveway. Then, I saw them. 2 men in bargain-bin tactical uniforms stood near my garage, hands resting on oversized belts, plastic badges catching the porch light. They had the posture of authority, but none of the confidence. And right beside them, arms folded tight across her chest, was Darlene Prescott, president of the Redstone Hollow Homeowners Association, smiling like she had finally cornered her prey. She tilted her head at me and said, almost sweetly, "We warned you." One of the fake officers stepped forward and announced my truck was being seized under HOA enforcement authority. They thought they were intimidating just another homeowner. They didn't know I was a federal task force officer. And they definitely didn't know what happens when you impersonate law enforcement in front of someone who carries real credentials. That night, the HOA didn't just overstep. They committed a felony. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I bought my place in Redstone Hollow, I thought I was finally stepping into something steady. Tree-lined streets, even sidewalks. Lawns trimmed with almost military precision. After years of unpredictable hours and rotating assignments, the idea of coming home to something quiet felt earned. That illusion lasted exactly 13 days. I came home one evening to find a bright orange notice taped across my front door like a scarlet letter. Violation of community standards. I stood there in my driveway reading it twice just to make sure I was not misunderstanding something obvious. The issue? My truck. The unmarked pickup assigned to me through the federal task force. No decals, no light bar, no equipment visible. To anyone else, it looked like a well-kept dark gray truck parked neatly inside my own driveway. According to the notice, it was classified as a commercial vehicle and therefore prohibited from overnight parking. I actually laughed the first time I read that. The next morning, Darlene Prescott showed up in person. She did not knock gently. She knocked like she was serving a warrant. When I opened the door, she was already holding a folder thick with printed bylaws, tabs sticking out like she had prepared for a trial. "I assume you saw the notice," she said. "I did," I replied calmly. "It's a federal vehicle, assigned to me. It's not commercial. It's not used for business deliveries. And it's legally parked on my property." She did not blink. Rules are rules. I offered documentation. I showed her the assignment letter. I explained that federal task force officers are often required to take vehicles home to maintain readiness. I even clarified that there were federal protections regarding interference with assigned equipment. She skimmed the paperwork without interest. "If we make exceptions for you," she said, "we have to make exceptions for everyone." It was not about fairness. It was about control. I could see it in her posture. The clipped tone. The way she spoke as if the HOA was a sovereign nation and she was its ruler. I stayed professional. Years in law enforcement teach you something valuable. Emotion is leverage. So I did not give her any. But within days, the letters multiplied. A notice about my grass being half an inch above the approved height, even though it had been cut 3 days earlier. A warning that my mailbox paint was slightly inconsistent with community tone. A fine because my trash can was visible from the street for 2 hours after pickup, on a day when I had been called into work unexpectedly before sunrise. Each envelope arrived like clockwork. Certified mail, highlighted clauses, payment deadlines in bold. It did not take long to realize this was not routine enforcement. No one else on my street seemed to be receiving weekly citations over microscopic details. Neighbors waved at me the same as before. No one complained. No one hinted that I was disrupting the community. I was being isolated. One afternoon, as I was trimming hedges that absolutely did not need trimming, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't exhaust yourself trying to win her over." I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man standing on the sidewalk. Late 60s. Perfect posture. calm eyes that scanned everything before settling on me. "Grant Hollis," he said, extending a hand. "Retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel?" 2 houses down. His handshake was firm but measured, the kind of grip that told you he understood discipline. "She's pushing hard," he added, nodding toward Darlene's house at the corner. "I've noticed," I said. Grant lowered his voice slightly. "You're not the first, but you're the most interesting." I raised an eyebrow. "She needs a target to stay in power," he said quietly. "Someone visible. Someone who won't roll over immediately. Makes her look strong." I considered that. In operations, we often talk about behavioral patterns. Once you identify the motive, you can predict the escalation. This was not about my truck. It was about maintaining authority through visible enforcement. Grant continued. "Most folks just pay the fine and keep their heads down. She counts on that." "I have no issue following reasonable rules," I said. "But this isn't reasonable," he nodded. "Document everything." That word stuck with me. Document everything. So I did. I kept copies of every notice, photographed my lawn measurements, recorded dates and times, saved emails, logged every interaction, not because I wanted conflict, but because I recognized it. The pattern was tightening, and Darlene was not slowing down. One evening, I watched from my window as she walked her dog past my driveway. She stopped briefly, stared at my truck, made a note on her phone. That was when it fully clicked. This was not an HOA issue. This was surveillance disguised as governance. And I was her chosen example. The mistake she made was assuming I would respond like everyone else. Pay quietly. Apologize unnecessarily. Comply without question. But the more she pushed, the more obvious it became that this was not about bylaws. It was about testing how far she could go. And people who test limits without understanding the law sometimes discover those limits the hard way. The tone of the letters changed before the volume did. At first, they were polite, sterile, printed on standard letterhead with phrases like friendly reminder and community standards compliance. But within a month, the envelope started arriving by certified mail, the kind that requires a signature, the kind designed to make you feel like you are already in trouble. The wording sharpened. Failure to comply may result in towing at owner's expense. Continued violation may result in property lien. Further non-compliance may trigger legal escalation. Each notice centered on the same claim, unauthorized commercial vehicle. Even after I had provided documentation, even after I had calmly explained, twice, that one truck was federally assigned and the other was registered strictly for personal use. The fines accumulated. $50. $100. Then $200. Not enough to cripple me financially. Just enough to be irritating. Strategic pressure. I paid the first 2 simply to avoid drama. But by the third, the pattern was undeniable. This was not enforcement. This was positioning. Darlene was building a paper trail she could later point to and say, "See? Repeated offender." So I stopped reacting emotionally and started preparing methodically. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building with folding chairs and a long plastic table at the front where the board sat like a tribunal. I arrived early, binder in hand. Calm. The room filled slowly. Couples in polos and cardigans, retirees whispering quietly. A few curious neighbors who had clearly heard about the ongoing friction. Darlene sat in the center seat at the front table, posture rigid, lips pressed thin. She wore a navy blazer like she was about to argue a Supreme Court case over lawn maintenance. When the floor opened for community concerns, she called my name before I even stood up. "Mr. Cole, your vehicle violations remain unresolved." I walked to the front with my binder. "I'd like to clarify that statement," I said evenly. I placed 2 documents on the table. The first was my personal truck registration. Privately owned. Standard classification. No commercial designation. Clean. The second was the federal assignment letter for my unmarked pickup. Official letterhead, clearly stating it was government property issued for law enforcement duties. It also included language referencing federal protections against interference. I did not raise my voice. I did not posture. I simply explained. My personal truck is registered for personal use. My assigned vehicle is federal property. Neither qualifies as commercial under county code, which I have included in this packet. I handed each board member a copy of the county definition of commercial vehicle. Highlighted sections, clear wording. Silence settled across the room. One of the board members, a middle-aged woman named Cynthia who had never spoken directly to me before, adjusted her glasses and read quietly. Another member flipped through the pages twice. Darlene's expression tightened. "These are HOA bylaws," she said sharply. "We are not bound by county definitions." "That may be," I replied, "but you are bound by enforceable language. And your own bylaws reference state vehicle classifications." I slid another printed page forward, a direct excerpt from the HOA rulebook. For the first time since I moved in, the balance shifted slightly. The other board members looked uncomfortable, not hostile, not defensive, just uneasy. Because this was no longer about preference. It was about being wrong in writing. Cynthia cleared her throat. "It appears the vehicle does not meet the commercial classification as written." Another board member nodded slowly. Darlene's jaw clenched. "I call for a vote," Cynthia said. Hands went up. 3 in favor of dismissing the violation. 1 abstention. Darlene alone voted to uphold it. The violation was dismissed. There was a quiet ripple in the room. Not applause, just a subtle exhale from people who had clearly grown tired of watching the tension. I gathered my documents calmly. No celebration. No smirk. Just closure. That should have ended it. Procedurally, it was resolved. The board had ruled. The classification was clarified. But as I turned to leave, Darlene spoke again. "This isn't over." She did not shout it. She did not whisper it either. She said it clearly. Directly at me. In front of everyone. The room froze for half a second. I stopped walking and looked back at her. Her eyes were not angry. They were humiliated. And that was far more dangerous. In law enforcement, there is a moment when you realize a suspect is no longer reacting logically but emotionally. That is when unpredictability increases. Up until that meeting, I had assumed this was a power struggle wrapped in paperwork. That sentence changed everything. This is not over. It was no longer administrative. It was personal. She had lost publicly. And people who rely on visible dominance do not tolerate public defeat gracefully. Grant caught up with me outside as I stepped into the parking lot. "She doesn't handle embarrassment well," he said quietly. I noticed. He studied my face. "Be careful." I nodded. Because I understood what had just happened. The paper trail she had been building collapsed. So now she would try something else. The escalation had shifted from letters to ego. And ego does not consult bylaws before it acts. Driving home that night, I remember glancing at my driveway under the streetlight. Both trucks parked neatly. No obstruction. No violation. For the first time, I felt less like a homeowner in a dispute and more like someone being measured. Tested. And when someone says, "This isn't over," after losing cleanly, it means they are already planning the next move. The only question was how far she was willing to go. I would find out soon enough. 2 weeks after the board dismissed the violation, I did something I had planned for years. I bought my dream truck. A heavy-duty pickup, deep charcoal gray. Clean lines, no decals. No business logos. Just a powerful, privately registered vehicle that I had saved for through more late nights and missed holidays than I care to count. For most people, buying a truck is a transaction. For me, it was a milestone. I parked it beside the federally assigned pickup in my driveway, stepped back, and allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. 2 vehicles. One representing my work. The other representing the life I was building outside of it. The next morning, there was another envelope taped to my door. Violation notice. I did not even need to read it to know who had signed it. 2 commercial vehicles in driveway. Immediate compliance required. I stood there in the early sunlight, rereading the line, waiting for the part where it made sense. There was no sense. The new truck had less than 50 miles on it. Standard private registration. Fully compliant under the exact definitions we had discussed at the board meeting. It was not a misunderstanding. It was retaliation. I did not confront her this time. I did not knock on her door. I did not attend another meeting immediately. Instead, I shifted from homeowner to investigator. Every notice was scanned and filed. Every date and time logged. Every envelope photographed before opening. I printed the dismissal vote record from the previous meeting and attached it to the new citation. Pattern established. Grant stopped by that afternoon when he saw me installing something under the edge of my garage roof. Cameras? He asked. Front driveway. Rear yard. Doorbell. Continuous recording. He nodded approvingly. Good. Think it'll go further? I asked. He looked down the street toward Darlene's house, then back at me. She doesn't want to win on paper anymore, he said. She wants you uncomfortable. That word stayed with me. Uncomfortable. Because that was the strategy. The notices did not slow down. In fact, they became shorter, more abrupt, less detailed. As if she no longer felt the need to justify herself. One email simply read, "Final warning before enforcement action." No explanation, no citation reference. Just pressure. 3 days later, I found a fluorescent sticker placed on my personal truck windshield. It peeled off easily, but it was not about adhesive. It was about signaling. You are being watched. That night, I reviewed my camera footage for the first time. There she was. Darlene walking slowly past my driveway at 9:30 in the evening, stopping just long enough to photograph both vehicles. Not illegal, but deliberate. I forwarded the clip to a private folder and kept it stored. I did not escalate yet. I waited. 2 days later, I was called into a multi-agency operation that ran longer than expected. By the time I wrapped up paperwork and cleared the scene, it was nearly 11 at night. The drive home was quiet. Empty roads. Street lights flickering against pavement. I remember thinking, oddly, that I was looking forward to sleep more than anything else. Then I turned into my cul-de-sac and saw flashing amber lights. For half a second, I assumed it was a utility truck. Then I saw my driveway, tow rig. Hydraulic arm extended. My personal truck lifted at the rear. 2 men in dark uniforms standing beside it. And Darlene Prescott positioned near the sidewalk, arms crossed, posture stiff with satisfaction. My engine was still running when I stepped out. The air smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and warm asphalt. The mechanical hum of the tow system echoed against the quiet houses. One of the uniformed men turned toward me. The uniform was close enough to law enforcement to confuse someone at a glance. Dark shirt. Utility belt. Badge clipped to chest. But it was wrong. The patches were generic. The stitching uneven. The badge too bright. "Sir," he said firmly, "this vehicle is being seized under HOA enforcement authority." Seized. That word landed heavier than anything else. I looked at Darlene. She did not look nervous. She looked triumphant. "We warned you," she said. Behind her, a few porch lights flicked on up and down the street. Curtains shifted. Neighbors were waking up to the spectacle. This was not a letter. This was theater. The tow driver, a man in his 40s wearing a reflective vest, avoided eye contact as he adjusted the chains. I walked closer, staying calm. "On what grounds?" I asked. The second uniformed man stepped forward, attempting authority. Repeated violations. Failure to comply. Court authorization. He held up a folded document. Court authorization. That was the moment something inside me shifted from irritated homeowner to trained investigator. Because paperwork like that does not materialize overnight, and court orders do not get enforced by HOA board presidents at 11 at night without proper law enforcement presence. I took the paper. Even before unfolding it, I could tell. Cheap printer stock. No watermark. No embossed seal. When I opened it, my last name was spelled incorrectly. That was the crack. Small, but fatal. I looked up slowly. "This isn't paperwork," I said quietly. This was escalation. Calculated. Public. Designed to humiliate. And the worst part? She thought she'd arranged it carefully enough that I would fold. She thought the uniform alone would intimidate me. She thought flashing amber lights and a fake badge would make me question myself. Instead, she had just crossed a line she did not understand. This was no longer about HOA enforcement. This was impersonation. And impersonation is not a bylaw issue. It is a crime. The tow truck's hydraulic system whined again as it tightened the lift. I reached into my jacket pocket calmly. Because this situation was about to change, dramatically. The man closest to me squared his shoulders like he had practiced the stance in a mirror. "We're with the county enforcement unit," he said, tapping the badge clipped to his chest. "We've been authorized to carry out the seizure. County enforcement unit." I almost felt insulted. I have worked alongside local agencies, state agencies, federal task groups, joint units that operate quietly and professionally. I know the names. I know the jurisdictions. I know the structure. There is no such thing as a county enforcement unit operating independently with HOA towing authority at 11 at night. "That agency doesn't exist," I said evenly. He blinked once, then recovered with forced confidence. "It's a subdivision under municipal code." No, it wasn't. He handed me the document. The paper was already creased, like it had been folded too many times. No embossed seal. No proper formatting. No docket number that matched county filing systems. And there it was. My last name misspelled in bold type across the top. Cole spelled C-O-L-E. On this document, it read C-O-A-L. That tiny error told me everything. This was not just an aggressive HOA maneuver. This was a fabricated legal instrument. I let the silence stretch for a moment while I scanned the page slowly. Then I looked up and asked calmly, "Which judge signed this?" The question landed harder than any accusation. The man glanced at his partner. His partner looked toward Darlene. Darlene shifted her weight but said nothing. Silence. I asked again, this time slower. "Which judge authorized this order?" The tow truck's hydraulic system hummed in the background, holding my truck suspended like a trophy. The driver, Eddie, I would learn his name later, had stopped tightening the chains. He was watching the exchange carefully now. The uniformed man swallowed. "It was processed through the county." "That wasn't my question," I replied. Another silence. I folded the paper once and handed it back to him. "This document is fraudulent," I said plainly. "There is no valid court seal, no docket number. And my name is misspelled." The second uniformed man's confidence cracked visibly. Darlene stepped forward then, voice rising slightly. "You've had multiple violations. We have authority under the bylaws." I turned to her. "Bylaws do not grant you judicial power." She opened her mouth to respond, but I had already reached into my jacket. The movement was slow. Deliberate, not dramatic. I withdrew my credentials and flipped the leather case open under the porch light. "Special Agent Mason Cole," I said clearly. "Federal Task Force." For a brief second, no one spoke. The amber lights reflected off the gold shield. The air felt heavier. The man holding the fake badge stared at my credentials, and I watched the realization hit him in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then fear. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost clinical. The second man took a half step backward. The tow driver lowered his hands completely and said quietly, "I didn't know." Darlene tried to regain control. "This isn't about that. This is about HOA enforcement." "No," I interrupted, calm but firm. "This is about criminal conduct." I shifted my gaze back to the two men in uniform. "You are presenting yourselves as law enforcement officers without legal authority. That is impersonation." I gestured toward my truck. "You are attempting to seize private property under a falsified court order. That is attempted illegal seizure." Then I looked directly at Darlene. "And you are orchestrating interference with a federal officer's property." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I continued, my tone steady and professional, the same tone I use when advising someone of their rights. Impersonation of law enforcement is a felony. Fabricating court documentation is a felony. Conspiracy to execute that fraud is a felony. The word hung there. Felony. Up and down the street, porch lights had multiplied. Neighbors were standing in doorways now, whispering. The quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a witness gallery. The first uniformed man's voice trembled slightly. We were hired for a security detail. That's all. By who? I asked, though I already knew. He hesitated. Darlene snapped. You don't have to answer that. I closed my credentials slowly but kept them visible. You absolutely do, I said. Because from this point forward, you are no longer conducting an HOA action. You are participating in a criminal act. The tow driver stepped back toward his cab. Sir, if there's a legal issue, I'll unhook it right now. That would be wise, I replied. The hydraulic arm whined again, this time lowering my truck back toward the pavement. The shift in power was almost physical. 10 minutes earlier, they had arrived confident, theatrical, expecting compliance. Now they were standing in a driveway under amber lights, realizing they had just tried to bluff the wrong person. Darlene's composure cracked next. You can't threaten us, she said, though her voice had lost its edge. I'm not threatening anyone, I answered. I'm stating facts. I pulled my phone from my pocket, and now I'm calling the actual authorities. The two impersonators exchanged a look that said more than any confession could have. They had expected paperwork and intimidation. They had not expected jurisdiction. They had not expected consequences. And Darlene, who had stood there smiling when I arrived, now looked like someone watching her carefully constructed plan dissolve in real time. The tow truck fully lowered my vehicle back onto the driveway. Metal clinked against asphalt. The fake badge on the first man's chest suddenly looked like plastic costume jewelry under the streetlight. I dialed dispatch calmly and requested a supervising officer for felony impersonation and attempted unlawful seizure. As I gave my name and location, I saw it in their faces. They understood. This was no longer a power play. This was exposure. And exposure carries weight. Within minutes, real sirens would turn onto this street. But in that moment, before the red and blue lights appeared, there was a silence that said everything. The illusion of authority had shattered. And now, the law they tried to fake was about to become very real. I kept my voice steady when the dispatcher answered. This is Special Agent Mason Cole, I said clearly. I need a supervising officer at my residence. Possible felony impersonation of law enforcement and attempted unlawful seizure in progress. There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when words like felony and impersonation land on a recorded line. Units are en route, the dispatcher replied. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. The two men in fake uniforms stood rigid now, no longer posturing. The confidence they had arrived with was gone. One of them avoided eye contact completely. The other kept glancing toward the end of the street like he was calculating escape routes. The tow driver had already stepped fully away from the controls, hands raised slightly as if to signal neutrality. I was just dispatched for a standard tow, he muttered. Didn't know about any of this. I nodded once. Stay put. Let's sort it cleanly. Darlene was the only one still trying to maintain composure. Her arms were crossed tighter than before, but her fingers twitched against her sleeves. The streetlights caught the tension in her jaw. You're blowing this out of proportion, she said. This is an HOA enforcement matter. No, I replied calmly. It stopped being that when you brought fake officers and forged documents into it. In the distance, I heard sirens, not the faint kind you question. The clear, rising wail of patrol units responding with urgency. Porch lights multiplied up and down the street. Doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto driveways in pajamas and robes. Phones appeared in hands. The quiet suburban bubble Darlene had relied on for years was cracking open. Red and blue lights flooded the cul-de-sac within minutes. 2 patrol cars entered first, positioning strategically near the tow truck. A third followed, blocking the exit. Doors opened in synchronized motion. Real uniforms stepped out. Real badges. Real authority. Sergeant Owen Ramirez exited the second vehicle, adjusting his duty belt as he approached. He was mid-40s, composed, the kind of officer who did not waste movement. He saw me immediately. "Mason," he said, recognition clear. "Owen," I replied with a nod. That brief familiarity shifted the atmosphere instantly. The impersonators saw it. Darlene saw it. The tow driver definitely saw it. "What's going on?" Ramirez asked. I handed him the folded document. Attempted vehicle seizure under a falsified court order. 2 individuals presenting as law enforcement. No valid agency identification. Ramirez unfolded the paper under the flashing lights and scanned it quickly. His expression changed from neutral to incredulous in seconds. "This is fake," he said flatly. "Yes." He turned to the 2 uniformed men. "Identify yourselves." The first one stammered his name. "Blake Turner." "Private security." "Private security where?" Ramirez asked. "Summit Protective Services. Do you have credentials authorizing law enforcement impersonation?" "No, sir." The word "sir" came out automatically now. Ramirez looked down at the badge pinned to Blake's chest. "Remove that." Blake's hands trembled slightly as he unclipped it. The second man followed suit without being told. Ramirez signaled to one of his officers. "Detain them." Handcuffs clicked into place, metal on metal. Real authority asserting itself. The tow driver immediately jogged back to the rig and fully unhooked my truck, lowering it cleanly onto my driveway. The hydraulic arm retracted with a mechanical groan that sounded almost like relief. "I had no idea they weren't legit," he said quickly. "I was told it was authorized." "You'll give a statement," Ramirez replied evenly. Up and down the street, neighbors stood watching openly now. Some whispered. Some recorded. The power dynamic had completely inverted. 10 minutes earlier, Darlene had stood in my driveway like a queen surveying conquered territory. Now she stood under flashing police lights as 2 men she hired were placed in handcuffs. "I didn't know," she said suddenly, voice thin. "I hired a security company. They said they had enforcement authority." Ramirez turned to her slowly. "You hired them?" Her eyes flicked toward me, then back to the sergeant. "Well, yes, but—" "And you provided them with this document." He held up the forged order. "They told me it was processed already." "That's not what I asked." She hesitated. The silence felt heavier than the sirens. "I coordinated the tow," she admitted, barely audible. Ramirez nodded once. "So you arranged for individuals posing as officers to seize a vehicle under a fraudulent court order." "That's not what I intended," she snapped, but her voice cracked halfway through. "Intent becomes secondary when actions are documented." I watched her carefully. She was not confused. She was cornered. Every patrol car light reflected off her navy blazer. The same blazer she had worn to dominate HOA meetings now looked strangely small against the scene unfolding around her. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact during board disputes were now standing in plain view, witnessing everything. Grant stepped out from his driveway 2 houses down, arms folded calmly, observing like a man who had seen similar collapses in different arenas. Ramirez spoke again, professional but firm. "Ma'am, you need to understand the seriousness of what just occurred. Impersonation of law enforcement is a felony. Fraudulent documentation is a felony. Conspiracy to commit unlawful seizure carries criminal exposure." The word exposure seemed to drain the last bit of defiance from her posture. "I was enforcing bylaws," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "You were escalating." She looked at me then, not with anger, not with authority, but with disbelief, because the illusion had dissolved. The entire neighborhood had just watched her attempt to use fake authority against someone she thought she could intimidate. Instead, she had summoned real law enforcement onto her own street. The 2 impersonators were placed in separate patrol cars, doors shut. Interior lights flicked on briefly as officers secured them. The tow truck idled uselessly. Ramirez turned back to me. "You'll need to give a statement." "Of course," he nodded toward Darlene. "And so will she." Her shoulders slumped slightly at that. For the first time since I moved into Redstone Hollow, she did not look in control. She looked small. The flashing lights continued to paint the houses red and blue. Neighbors lingered, absorbing every detail. This was no longer whispers at HOA meetings. This was public accountability. And once that switch flips, it does not flip back easily. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had shattered. And the consequences were just beginning. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond our cul-de-sac. Redstone Hollow was the kind of neighborhood where people pretended not to gossip, but somehow always knew everything. The flashing lights the night before had erased any illusion of privacy. Everyone had seen the patrol cars. Everyone had seen the handcuffs. And everyone had seen Darlene standing in the middle of it. Blake Turner and Sean Harlow did not hold out long. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Ramirez called to update me. Both men had given formal statements. They admitted they were employees of Summit Protective Services, a small private security contractor operating 2 counties over. Darlene had contacted the company personally, claiming she needed official-looking enforcement support for a non-compliant resident. Official-looking. That phrase alone said everything. According to their statements, she specifically instructed them to dress official to ensure compliance. They were told to bring badges, utility belts, and to present the paperwork she provided as legitimate authority. They had not created the forged document themselves. She had handed it to them. The company owner, once confronted with the facts, cooperated quickly. Within days, Summit Protective Services was under investigation for negligent oversight. Their license was suspended pending review. By the end of the week, it was revoked entirely. One reckless decision had cost multiple people their livelihoods. As for Darlene, the charges came next. Conspiracy to commit fraud, presentation of falsified documentation, attempted unlawful seizure of property. The district attorney did not treat it as an HOA dispute. They treated it as what it was: coordinated criminal behavior dressed up as neighborhood governance. She was not arrested dramatically. There were no late-night raids. She was issued a summons and processed like anyone else facing white-collar charges. But in a community like Redstone Hollow, a criminal summons carries more weight than handcuffs. Within 48 hours, the HOA board announced an emergency meeting. Not the usual monthly gathering. An emergency session. Attendance mandatory for board members, open to all residents. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Folding chairs lined the walls. People stood along the back. The energy felt different from every meeting before. There was no quiet compliance, no polite nodding. There was tension. Darlene sat at the center table again, but this time she looked smaller somehow. Her posture was rigid, but not authoritative. Defensive. The remaining board members avoided eye contact with her. When the meeting opened, there was no small talk. Cynthia, the same board member who had voted to dismiss the vehicle violation weeks earlier, cleared her throat and began reading from a prepared statement. She summarized the police report. She referenced the forged document. She cited the impersonation charges. There were no embellishments, just facts. Every sentence landed like a measured strike. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Grant stood up. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. But when a retired Marine lieutenant colonel stands to speak, people listen. For years, he began calmly, we trusted this board to protect property values and maintain community standards. That trust was not meant to be weaponized. He turned slightly toward Darlene. Authority without restraint becomes abuse, and abuse damages more than lawns or driveways. It damages trust. No one interrupted him. He continued, this was not a misunderstanding. It was deliberate escalation, and it exposed every one of us to liability. That word, liability, hit the room differently than emotion ever could. Because now the issue was not personal. It was structural. If Darlene had been willing to fabricate court documents against me, what else might she have done in the name of enforcement? Cynthia then read the motion formally, a vote to remove Darlene Prescott from her position as president of the Redstone Hollow Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Darlene tried once to speak. This is political, she said weakly. I was protecting the integrity of our community. But the argument sounded hollow now. There were no raised hands defending her. No murmurs of support, just measured silence. The vote was called. One by one, hands went up. Unanimous. No abstentions. No hesitation. The woman who had once dominated meetings with sharp tones and rigid posture sat frozen as the final vote was counted. Removed. Just like that. No theatrics. No shouting. Just a formal stripping of authority in the same room where she had once tried to strip mine. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. She gathered her papers slowly. The navy blazer she favored suddenly looked less like a uniform and more like a costume. As she stood to leave, no one stopped her. No one followed her. No one applauded. Silence can be louder than condemnation. Grant was nominated as interim president before the meeting ended. The motion passed quickly. Calm leadership replacing volatile control. When I stepped outside afterward, the night air felt different than it had the week before. Not triumphant, not celebratory. Just steady. Several neighbors approached quietly to thank me. Not for fighting, but for not backing down. That distinction mattered. Because this had never been about revenge. It had been about accountability. Inside her house, across the street, a single lamp flicked on behind closed blinds. The woman who weaponized bylaws had lost the very authority she used to intimidate. Not through shouting, not through retaliation, but through exposure. And once exposure enters the equation, collapse becomes inevitable. Redstone Hollow was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. One built on clarity instead of fear. The criminal case moved on its own timeline, but I was not interested in waiting for slow consequences alone. What happened in my driveway had not just been embarrassing for Darlene. It had been costly, disruptive, and calculated. I had been forced to defend myself against something that never should have happened in the first place. So I made another call. Lydia Mercer answered on the second ring. She was a civil litigation attorney based in the next county over sharp, precise, and known for not wasting time on theatrics. I laid out the situation plainly. The fabricated order, the impersonators, the attempted tow, the police involvement. There was a short pause after I finished. "Do you have documentation?" she asked. "I have everything," I replied. And I did. Police reports detailing the arrest of Blake Turner and Sean Harlow. Photographs of the forged document. Body camera footage from responding officers. Witness statements from neighbors. Camera footage from my own property showing Darlene observing, coordinating, supervising. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was layered. Lydia did not sound surprised. She sounded focused. "We will pursue civil claims for harassment, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and attempted unlawful seizure," she said. Given the police involvement, liability exposure is significant. She was not emotional about it. Just factual. Within a week, formal notice was served. Darlene's attorney responded quickly. Far quicker than she had responded to any HOA complaint I had ever received. The tone had shifted dramatically. Where once she had cited bylaws and enforcement rights, her legal representation now cited mitigation, misunderstanding, and regret over procedural errors. Procedural errors. That phrase almost made me laugh. Forging court documents and hiring impersonators was not a procedural misstep, it was deliberate escalation. Lydia laid out the damages cleanly. Legal fees incurred defending the false enforcement. Emotional distress from public humiliation and unlawful intimidation. Financial disruption caused by attempted seizure. Loss of quiet enjoyment of property. She did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize, she documented. And documentation wins. Darlene's attorney requested mediation quickly. That was the moment I knew they understood the gravity. In mediation, facts speak louder than arguments. And the facts were not in her favor. The police report alone established criminal conduct. The impersonator's signed statements tied her directly to the instruction to dress official. The forged document bore her fingerprints, both figuratively and literally. And perhaps most damaging of all, there were witnesses, neighbors who had watched the entire spectacle unfold under flashing patrol lights. This was not a private dispute. It was public. Settlement negotiations did not drag on. They moved with urgency. Her counsel knew that if this went to open court, the narrative would become permanent record. The agreement was finalized within weeks. It covered every dollar of my legal fees. It paid off the balance on my new truck entirely. And it included additional compensation for damages and distress. There were no admissions of guilt in the settlement language. There rarely are, but there was no ambiguity either. She had overreached, and it cost her. The funds transferred quietly, no press releases, no announcements. But in a neighborhood like Redstone Hollow, silence speaks. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was undergoing change. Grant Hollis was formally elected president at the next scheduled board meeting. Unlike Darlene, he did not take the seat like a throne. He took it like a responsibility. His first action was not punitive, it was corrective. He ordered a full review of the bylaws, not to weaken them, but to clarify them. Vague language that could be interpreted broadly was rewritten with specificity. Enforcement procedures were formalized to require documented consensus, not unilateral action. No more single-person escalation. No more ambiguous clauses that could be weaponized. Transparency became policy. Communication improved almost immediately. Notices, when issued, were measured and factual. Disputes were handled in open discussion, not taped to doors at sunrise. The atmosphere shifted. Neighbors began lingering outside again in the evenings. Children rode bikes without the quiet tension of someone watching from behind blinds. Conversations in driveways felt relaxed instead of cautious. For the first time since I moved in, my house felt like a home rather than a contested territory. Both trucks remained parked in my driveway. No more fluorescent stickers. No more certified letters. No more final warnings. One afternoon, as I washed my truck under a clear Tennessee sky, I noticed movement across the street. The blinds in Darlene's front window shifted slightly. She did not step outside anymore. She did not walk past my driveway with a camera in hand. The authority she once wielded so freely had evaporated. Not because someone shouted louder. Not because someone retaliated recklessly. But because the moment she replaced rules with intimidation, she stepped outside the protection of the very structure she relied on. Turning the tables did not require aggression. It required patience, documentation, and the willingness to follow through. Redstone Hollow did not transform overnight into some perfect suburban utopia. But it became steady, predictable, calm. And in my line of work, calm is not something you take for granted. Sometimes justice is dramatic. Sometimes it is loud. And sometimes it is simply watching the people who try to intimidate you avoid eye contact every time you pull into your own driveway. For the first time since moving in, there were no warning letters waiting at my door. Only quiet. And that quiet felt earned. Sometimes people mistake authority for power. Darlene believed that a title on a homeowners association letterhead gave her control over every driveway, every mailbox, every blade of grass in Redstone Hollow. She thought enforcement meant domination. She thought rules were weapons she could sharpen and aim at whoever she decided needed correcting. What she forgot is that authority only works when it is rooted in legitimacy. The moment she stepped outside the law, the moment she chose intimidation over procedure, everything she built collapsed under its own weight. I still park both trucks in my driveway. The federally assigned pickup, the heavy-duty truck I worked years to afford. They sit there openly, exactly where they belong. No more certified envelopes taped to my door. No more late-night threats. No more fluorescent warnings. Every now and then, I catch the blinds across the street shift slightly when I step outside. A small movement. A reminder that some lessons linger, but she never looks me in the eye. And honestly, that silence says more than any violation notice ever could. What I learned is simple. When someone abuses small authority to feed their ego, eventually they collide with someone who understands real law. And when that happens, the rules they tried to bend apply to them too. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?